about, having a relationship and relationships that elevate. And so I think that this is pertinent today. It is very important today for us to look at freedom within the context of relationships, in this word, relationships. So I want to let us start there on looking at freedom as a freedom that lives in the interconnections, in us connecting with others, in us connecting with ourselves, and the freedom that also lives with the interdependencies. We're all interdependent. We're interdependent on one another, and we are interdependent in the world that we live. So this word freedom it has a very broad meaning, but I think its roots are in relationships, are in connections, and are in interdependencies. And these three words, relationships, interconnections, and interdependencies, they all start from the level of the individual. And of course, it plays out in the individuals, in interpersonal relationships, in families, in communities, in nations, and of course, in the world. And it is something that people strive for, whether it is the individual striving for its freedom, or whether it is the family striving for its freedom, or whether it is, today the nations want their self-sovereignty, they want their sovereignty, and they want their countries to be independent, they want their freedom. And of course, in India, we know that that was something that was nearest and dearest to Gandhi. He fought for the freedom, and he started, why did he fight for the freedom of India, which then had the domino effect around the world of all countries then becoming decolonialized? It was because of a personal affront that he saw when he was in Natal in South Africa. And so that drove him back to India. And being a lawyer, he understood what freedom meant within the context of not only when an individual is violated, but also when a country wants to get out of the bondage or of the rule of anything that's foreign. And it is also so for Nelson Mandela and his beautiful book, The Road to Freedom, speaks a lot about how an individual always has to have a certain amount of individual will in order to walk a road to freedom, in order to free anything or anyone else. And so, these are all the broad contexts of freedom. And also within the United Nations, they have what is called the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights. And that declaration, the one who headed up the committee to bring that out was Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of President Roosevelt. And he was the one who spoke about the four freedoms. And so the Declaration of Human Rights is actually set within the context of four freedoms. Having set that very wide context, I now want to narrow down and come to someone on a spiritual path, someone who has decided that they want to walk a spiritual path, and in so doing, they want to rediscover and reclaim their freedom. And in reclaiming this freedom, they are basically rediscovering their sovereign. They're taking back the rule, the self-rule. They're taking back that rule over themselves. So once you start ruling yourselves, that is a freedom a very big freedom, because then you don't come under the compulsion of others, and you are then not controlled by others, because you now, it's just like a country. When a country gets its sovereign, like when India got its independence, it cut all ties gradually with everything that it felt threatened its sovereignty. And so, in the same way, when the individual begins its spiritual path and it wants to reclaim its self sovereign, it begins to notice things that are threatening its sovereignty, and it protects itself from things that would threaten its sovereignty, because it doesn't want to lose its freedom. It doesn't want to be controlled by anyone or anything else. Now, on this spiritual path, however, when we start looking at our freedom and we start looking at how we can reclaim our freedom, we begin to see that what actually stands in the way of our freedom is not an invasion from anything external, but it is actually an invasion from something inside of us. So when we talk about, I want to be free from the bondage of a relationship, for instance, I don't want to lose the relationship, but I want to be freed from the bondage of the relationship. I want a free and equal partnership in this relationship. I don't want to feel subservient in the relationship. So what I'm saying, I want to be free. I want to be myself. I want to be who I am. And I want to have this relationship. So when I look at it from that perspective, then on a spiritual path, I'm having to see what it is that I carry inside of me that's robbing me the freedom in this relationship. Now, I may blame the other person with all the reasons that they have me in bondage to this relationship. But ultimately, what our spiritual insight is telling us, or our spiritual wisdom is telling us, is to go within and see what you are holding on to that is tying you in bondage to relationships that you need to get rid of. So that's the first thing. I need to understand that in order to hold on to my self-sovereignty, and self-sovereignty means my authentic self, self-sovereignty means my true self, self-sovereignty means I want to be who I am. If I really want to be free at that level, then I need to look at what it is I have tied myself with that I need to untie and I need to get rid of. And it is an inside job. This thing of becoming free is something that we have to do by ourselves, for ourselves, but of course, with the help of God. And this is why we do meditation, to get the strength to untie the tangled web that we have created for ourselves inside of us. And today, everything we are crying out for that we want others to do for us, it's actually something that I have to do for myself. So, freedom is a very important factor on a spiritual path. Now, in another way of saying freedom, you could say liberation, or you could say liberation in life, or as America loves freedom, it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. But their symbol of freedom is the Statue of Liberty. So liberty is also freedom. So these are all words that are used for this ultimate aspiration that we as individuals are aspiring to. We want it. We really do want our liberty, our freedom, our liberation in life, because that is what gives us back our true worth. That is what gives us back our authenticity. That is what gives us back that the true meaning of who I am. And so today, what I want to do is to take up the four freedoms that the world has known. And most constitutions, actually, most political constitutions are written taking these four freedoms into consideration. And of course, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was written just after the Charter. So a lot of the countries drew on this document when they were also creating their own constitutions. And so, but within the Human Rights Declaration, it also has a very beautiful spiritual line. And the beautiful spiritual line says, all human beings are born free and equal, endowed with reason and conscience. Now, that's not a political statement. That is a spiritual statement. It's a spiritual fact that in every human soul, endowed are their reasoning and their conscience. No one is born into the world and someone says, here, I'm going to endow you with a reason and a conscience. A kid doesn't go to school and the teacher is going to say, you know what, I'm going to teach you how you can create a reason and a conscience. They could say, I can help you let it grow, I can help you enhance it, but the recognition there is in every human soul, there is reason and conscience. So these four freedoms, whether you see it, you know, in a political context or a social context, it would be the same as if you were to see it in the personal spiritual context, because it is from the basis of the personal spiritual context that, you know, the social and the political and the economic, everything would grow, because human beings created those systems. And so those systems cannot come into existence in and of themselves. They were created by human beings. They were created out of human souls. And so within the human soul has got all the ingredients that would cater for good or bad, that would cater for freedom or bondage. And so this reason and conscience that is closely connected to my freedom is something that I have to learn to see inside of myself and learn to develop it in a way that would help me reclaim my freedom. So the four freedoms are: one, freedom from fear. And we all could relate to that. We all are today living in a world in which there is so much of fear that we want this freedom from the fears that we have. The second freedom is freedom from want. Now, in the world, everybody, one of the biggest abuses is the abuse of the environment. And that abuse of the environment is because it comes from I want, I want, I want, I want. So the more I want, it's the more I'm going to be in bondage to that which I am taking from. So I'm losing my freedom there. In a relationship as well, the more I want, I want, I want, I want from that relationship, I'm in bondage to it. I've lost my freedom. And so what we need is this freedom from want. You know, there's enough for every person's need, but not for every person's greed. The moment greed enters the equation, freedom is lost. And so this whole idea of freedom from fear. So there are two freedoms: freedom from fear and freedom from want. There are two other freedoms, and that is freedom of speech and freedom of belief. Now, in today's world, there's a lot of freedom of speech. There are a lot of words. And so the words within that freedom to say what I want, when I want, how I want, I have actually lost my freedom. And so now I need to revisit that. What is the true freedom of speech? What is the true freedom of words? And then the final one is freedom of belief. We have been brought up within certain context of right and wrong. And within the context of right and wrong, there is the biggest struggle, because every right is connected to a belief system, whether it is religion, whether it is culture, whether it is social, whether it is, national, patriotic. And so I am in bondage to it, and I'm not free, even if I do sincerely believe what someone is doing in a country to be wrong. My patriotic kind of loyalty to the country would justify the wrong. And so that's not freedom. So the freedom of belief is to really go beyond the right and wrong factor, and to be in a state which we call soul consciousness, in order to see everything from a detached observer, and to really connect it to what I said we all have in the soul, which is reason and conscience, and then to let that work from the enlightenment within. And then we make a decision based on a belief that is higher than the ones that we have been trapped into and we have been operating from, that are very secular and that are very divisive and that do not include. And so when I go to a level of spirituality, then my reason and conscience would be operating from a level in which it allows for inclusivity. It allows for me to see things from all sides around. It allows for me to see not right and wrong, but the dignity of the human being and the value of their worth. And so this is where freedom starts from. And so when we walk this path of spirituality, the first thing we encounter is the understanding of who I am. And once I understand who I am, it sets me free. Soul consciousness sets me free. It sets me free from the fear of mortality. And that's the biggest fear. I have a fear of death. Everybody's got a fear of death. And that is why they're calling COVID-19 an invisible enemy, because this invisible enemy doesn't have a cure, doesn't have a treatment, and it's taking people's lives. And so we're living in a world of death. Death is just facing us. But when I realize that I am a soul, I am an immortal being, then I live as an immortal being in mortality, in my body, because I know one day I'll have to leave the body. So it releases me first and foremost from the fear of death. And that's the aspiration of soul consciousness. So every time we say, consider yourself to be a soul, and center yourself in the center of the forehead, and recognize that you are this beautiful spiritual being who is an immortal, eternal, an imperishable being, then you live in the freedom of life, and you don't live in the fear of death. And so that is a beautiful experience to have, even if it is in a second. And then every time you practice it, you move out of the parameters or the limitations of the body, and therefore you conquer death. Death is just a pause in the journey of life. So you begin to see it differently. And so that is how you would deal with fear. And so to become free, how to become free from fear is to consider yourself to be a soul and to move, to let there be the movement of soul consciousness. And the movement of soul consciousness is the movement of something that is always living. So you choose to move with the movement of life, with the movement of soul conscious life. Now, within the movement of soul conscious life, because Jyoti Bindu, this point of light, is life, is living, is life, it's the life force. Then you're looking at the alignment of your thoughts, of your words, of your actions, to what is inside of the soul. And what's inside of the soul is the light and might, which we call as the sanskaras, the personality traits, light and might of love, the light and might of joy, the light and might of truth, the light and might of peace, the light and might of purity. So then you start connecting to the dimension of the soul that is full of its light and might, that keeps you moving. The movement is upward. The movement is toward liberation. The movement is toward the freedom of the soul from the bondage of its body. So that's the first aspect of how to be free. The second one is free to become the freedom from want. You know, today's world is actually pushing us back, but at the same time pushing us forward. This freedom from want is that we live our lives like consumers. We live our lives like caterpillars. And so we're always consuming, we're always taking in things. And the more we've got, the more we want. And then, of course, the world has turned into the largest supermarket, and the world is catering to the consumer's appetite. And of course, they are producing more and more and more. And we, the consumers, are being coerced or coaxed or, psychologically manipulated to buy more and more and more, because we start identifying ourselves with that which we want more of. So I have a car, I want a new one. I have a Nike shoes, I want another one. And so it never stops. There's more and more and more of this that's taking place. And so this freedom from want is a freedom that is very important for us to have now. And how do I free myself from all the needs that are within me, all these desires that I don't know where they come from, but I have them. How do I free myself from being psychologically and emotionally manipulated by ads that tell me that I need this when I don't, and I just get coerced into getting it? How do I stop that cycle of of being that consumer, being that caterpillar, eating the grass, just consuming things? Well, the spiritual way of doing this is what's called mastery. I need to become a master of myself. And the mastery literally is to connect back to purpose. If I connect back to the purpose of my life, is the purpose of my life to be a consumer? Is the purpose of my life to be a caterpillar? Or is the purpose of my life to understand the philosophy of karma, to understand that whatever I take, there is a consequence, there's a cause and a consequence. So whatever I take, I am held accountable for that taking. And so the mastery of connecting to purpose is understanding the deep philosophy of give and take with my material world, the give and take with my fellow human beings. And if I could understand and apply this absolute law of karma to my life, it will free me from many, many things, but particularly from the wants that's cluttering my life. It will unclutter my life. The wants in my life is cluttering me. And what the wants clutter most of all in life, it clutters the conscience. So the conscience does not operate. That's the morality. That's the spirituality. That's the compass that will guide me in terms of what I should be doing and what I should not be doing. And if that gets cluttered with all the wants that I have, then of course I'm going to justify poverty by saying that, we're developing. In the name of development, if people are marginalized so that bigger cities could be built, so that there could be more wants fulfilled, then poverty is justified. And so then my conscience gets suppressed. So if I start, connecting to the purpose of life, then I'm going to begin to see that my conscience won't allow me to support certain things in which it's creating an imbalance in my life and an imbalance in my world. So then I start getting rid of my wants and I start living a simpler life. And I start teaching those who are near and dear to me to live simpler lives. And this is where it's simplicity, simple living, elevated thinking, high thinking, enough for every human being's needs, but not for every human being's greed. And every grain of rice has got someone's name on it, do not waste. So all of these things we'll be able to do not just by changing our thoughts, but by really understanding the principle from which the thought has to be generated. And if I don't understand the principle, then it's just a ping pong game with my negative and positive thoughts. And then the other one is the freedom of speech. And that is particularly if I want to be free to express. And in the hands of Vishnu, or in most churches, they have the conch shell. In most of the Hindu temples, they would have that conch shell. And the conch shell is a symbol of words. Now, why words have become a trap for us, and we are it's like a spider's web. We have actually wound ourselves around in the bondage of our own words. It is because that one freedom has been misused, and in the misuse of the freedom, we got trapped by our words. And this is why they say, words once sounded cannot be recalled. It's because once you say these words, you can't recall them, or you can't delete them. They've gone into your account, and you have to be accountable for them at some level. And so in order to become free to express myself, because words are important for the individual to express themselves, but the freedom is to express myself within the context of respect, of respecting another, of respecting, an environment within which I will speak, in terms of respecting myself, because the words I will create will first debase me, will first make me a smaller person inside before I even express them. So I become the victim of my own words. And so to have that freedom of speech, once again, is to think about how to have meaningful engagements. So if my words are intended to engage another, then that engagement must have meaning. And so I must look for the meaning behind my words, because now as I speak them, I am going to be reaching out to others and engaging them into something meaningful. Now, even, if you were to even apply this to the way you speak to children, it would be such a shift in the way children speak and their choice of words. And today there are a lot of words, but there's very little meaning. And so the freedom of speech, or the freedom of words, is for us to blow that conch shell, because that sound, that sound that goes out into the world from my mouth should be intended for meaningful engagements, and should be intended that those words are giving some sort of sanctity to my world. And that world starts from inside of me, and it starts in my immediate family. And that's why we say here, on a spiritual path, the one thing that we learn is to speak softly, and to speak sweetly, and to speak less. Because you don't have to say a lot of words if you want to convey a meaning. And so try to cut back more on the volume of the words in order to stay true to the essence of the meaning that you want to engage the other with. And then, of course, the fourth freedom is the freedom of belief. And that freedom of belief is where, for us, meditation is very important, and the contemplation and the reflection. Because when we come on a spiritual path, it calls on us to be more contemplative people, to be more reflective people, because we want to we want to have the freedom to believe in ourselves, to believe in God, to believe in the drama of life. But believing is very beautiful. But when a belief, a dogma, gets, in the way of my believing something, then I'm not open enough. You see, freedom means you're opening up yourself. You are removing, barriers. You are removing boundaries. You are making yourself open to see things in a way that you haven't actually seen them before. And we call this a vision of soul consciousness. The soul begins to see the connections of everything. The soul begins to see how everything is interdependent. The soul begins to see that, when you're living in, for instance, if you're driving on a road, that road is a shared space. It's not just for me and my car, but it's for everybody else and their car. And so this kind of belief becomes an inclusive believing, and not an exclusive believing that it just belongs to me, and because I come from this culture and I believe that, I have to stick to this, and I can't even think of how someone else thinks about it, because that is not my culture, that is not my religion. So all of that holds us, takes away our freedom. But if I open up myself, and this is what Baba does to us, this is what God does to us, God rises up, he raises the souls up and say, look at your world from a dimension of up above. Go above and then observe what's happening in your world, and you will see how everything is connected and how everything is interdependent. And that allows for us to be inclusive, and it gives us this, this sense of meditation gives us the ability to build inner capacity and inner resilience. Because if I don't resist anything, there's resilience in me. The more I try to resist, I will break my resilience. And so resilience is required when there is resistance. But if I keep resisting, then the rubber band would burst. And so it gives us a beautiful spiritual capacity to be inclusive, to connect, to look at the interdependencies, and to do it with a deep and profound wisdom that the creation that we live in is a shared space. And everyone has a right to be in this shared space. And this meditation would then release us from our false beliefs and free us to see things with wisdom and with spiritual truths. And then it would also free us to have respect for another that is different from me, and to embrace them with spiritual love. So I wanted to stop there because I wanted to give you a few, for you to ask me a few questions in relation to this. And also if we wanted to do a little bit of meditation. But just to cap it back, just to put a summary on it, I shared with you 4 freedoms and I shared with you 4 M's. So the 4 freedoms were freedom from fear. And in order to have the freedom from fear, I must have the movement of soul consciousness, the letting go of things that are holding the soul to the body, of letting go of the attachments, of all the vices and all the weaknesses that attaches the soul to the body. And so I could live in my immortality while in the mortal body. The other one is freedom from want. And for that, I need the second M, which is mastery. I need to connect to the purpose of my life. And I need to master that purpose in my life so I can become a sovereign. And so no one would trespass the territory of my sovereignty to take away my freedom. And the third is the freedom of speech. And for the freedom of speech, I need to have meaningful engagement. I need to create words that would carry meaning. And then the fourth is the freedom of belief. And for that, I need to become a contemplative person, a reflective person, a meditative person, so I can push the boundaries of my consciousness to include others, and don't use a dogma or a belief to exclude others or to exclude myself from others, but I must see them with a profound love and respect, because we do share the same creation. So I wanted to leave you with those, and then you can now ask me some questions.
So please, if you have any questions, can you write it in the chat box? Okay. So a lot of them have enjoyed your talk, Didi, and they're saying it's a beautiful talk. The first question is, please clarify how to identify that freedom is needed when we are trapped in fear or belief, etc.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. The way you would identify a lack of freedom is fear. So there will be something inside of you that would show up as fear. And once it shows up as fear, then you know that it's impinging on your freedom. And in order to get the freedom, you would need to explore yourself to see how you can get out of that which is creating that fear. And this is why we teach meditation, because the only way you can see a fear is if you become soul conscious. You know, we tell you to consider yourself to be a soul, and then look at yourself, because within yourself there are 2 elements, and that is your darkness and your light. When you are in the consciousness of being the light, it is then you will be able to see what's in the darkness. If you're in the consciousness of being the darkness, you won't be able to see what's in the darkness. So this is what we are calling as to distinguish a belief that is creating a fear. It means that if I am in a situation that's causing me to be fearful, to resist, to have any of those negative, attitudes towards it, rather than project and say the reason for my fear is on the outside, I then have to go and go to the fourth M, become the meditative person, the contemplative person, and then look within and say, is there a certain sanskara in the form of belief I'm carrying that's causing me to behave this way? I'll give you an example. This is not about a religious belief, but this is about something that created a belief in a person that caused her to behave in a certain way. Now, there was in India many years ago a gang rape of someone, of this girl, that became a very big story in Delhi. And of course, it went on and on and on and on in the media. Now, this person listening to it, she of course got totally, influenced by it. It created a certain belief in her that she didn't even know it got created in her until she traveled to India. And she was sharing the story, and it was an amazing story. And as soon as she arrived in India and she came out of the airport, and at the airport in Delhi, she was looking at all these men, all of a sudden a fear gripped her. And she didn't want to take a taxi. She didn't want, because each person she was looking at, she says, appeared in front of her eyes as a potential rapist. And then, because she was a meditator, she went home and she says, well, what has suddenly happened? What happened to me there? And then when she checked within herself, again, she's taking her light part of herself, which is a soul, and checking to see what just occurred in her behavior and what was spinning this behavior into her vision of these people. She realized by just listening to the news over and over and over again, it created a belief in her that started showing up, and she became afraid of it. So that is an example of how a belief can create a fear. But then to identify the fear is important, but that is not the end of it. To free yourself from that fear, you need to go back and check within, why did you behave like that under that fear? Or why did the fear cause you to behave like that? Once you identify the behavior, it is then you will take it back and look at the belief that you have that spurred that behavior, the belief that's lying inside of you.
Thank you, Didi. That was beautifully explained. Didi, there's another question here. There's a soul who wants to know, how should the developing world approach a rapid age of industrialization while practicing and retaining soul consciousness?
I think, there are some industrialists, there are some, social responsible businesses in which they are, I don't know if they're practicing soul consciousness, but at least they're practicing some sort of values. Now, in order for that to happen, you see, a city is made up of people. What is a city but its people? what is an industrial organization or corporation, but it's people. And so one is that the people have created the rules by which they play the game. And the end product of the game, the winning in the game, is the profits. And so profits have been put above people. And so the value of the product is given more of a worth than the value of the human being. So if individuals were to and this is where the conscience comes in, the reason, the conscience. If individuals populating the industrial world were to recognize that what they're doing is a spiritual violation, is the violation of a spiritual law that will backfire eventually, then their conscience would somehow connect to that spiritual law, and they would say, no, wait a minute, I need to shift and look at what is more worthy here. Is it the product or is it the person? And so if the product cannot exist without the person, then I must invest in the person, and not just in the person as a machine to produce more products, but in the actual well-being of the person. Now, many of them have got to that point, but then the next, to go even higher than that, is say, how can I understand that this individual is a soul, is a being, is life? And how can I help to support the evolvement of spiritual values within the individual, as well as within myself? How can I see that in doing so, it will raise the consciousness of the industrial world? And we may get less products and less profits, but we are creating a world with healthier people. We're giving a recognition to the worth of these people, and we're allowing the wealth to be more, there be more equity in the wealth of the world. Now, that can only happen if they move back to those fundamental spiritual principles, spiritual laws, and spiritual qualities of the human being that would allow them to work from enlightened consciousness. Now, at the rate the world is going, we are seeing that maybe that's an impossible task for many, but it doesn't take the whole world to change the equation. We are already seeing the equation changing with the stock market and with what's happening in the world. But where do they go to for solace and strength and meaning making and all of that eventually? They will all have to return to that spiritual force within them. And of course, ultimately to God. Because there's nowhere else to go when it comes to meaning of life and purpose of life and worth of life. And then just think about if someone had people in sweatshops making goods for profit, how would that person's conscience be able to take that eventually? Now, all of this borders on soul consciousness, and the conscience is a pivotal part of soul consciousness, which is very little talked about, because people don't like the word conscience, yet conscience is Vivek that lives in the soul. And that conscience, if awakens, we become naturally soul conscious.
Wow, Didi, this was so in-depth. You took it to the next level. How beautiful. Didi, one more question. Just there are a few more, but we'll address one. When we talk about freedom from belief, we always talk about replacing our belief system with a new one. But isn't it a wrong thing to do? Isn't like replacing an addiction by a different addiction?
Well, if belief becomes a system, then the system takes precedent over what the person is believing in. So for instance, you have religions, and the religions have teachings. People are asked to believe in the teachings, not in the systems. And so, but they say the systems are there to protect the teachings. But then the teachings get lost in the systems, and the people then become pawns to the systems. And the belief in the teachings then get lost. So if you were to take the teachings out of the system, you would see that there are certain commonalities that carry a unifying force with them. But if you take those same teachings and put it in the system, then the system divides. And so what we're saying here, a freedom of belief or religion, the person is entitled to. Everyone is entitled to believe in the teachings, and that gives them the freedom of the soul. And so when one looks at the spiritual dimension of the teachings, then they get the freedom. They return, the freedom returns to the soul to have, for instance, a direct relationship with God, and they don't have to go through someone else or something else to have that direct relation with God. And so this is what they're saying, is that no system should hold a soul, a human being, a prisoner, and stop the individual from rising to the heights of his spirituality through the teachings. And so that's, I think, is important, an important distinction to understand. And not to allow a belief system to keep you from evolving to the highest spiritual dimension that, or your highest spiritual potential that you're capable of.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. Otherwise, we could have taken a few more questions. So, Didi, would you like to do a minute or two of meditation?
Sure.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much. They were very interesting questions. I didn't expect the questions should be that deep. Anyway, but thank you. A good bunch of you listening. I can't
So I was thinking, Didi, let me just thank everyone, and then you can do meditation and we can move out in silence. So just want to thank you, Didi, for this amazing, the most beautiful, wonderful, stimulating talk. I just can't even tell you, I don't have words to thank you for this time you took out. I know you're so busy in Peace Village, teachers retreat and everything else that is happening around you. But thank you, thank you, thank you. And to all the audience today, they have learned a lot about how to be free from you, from Gayatri Didi's talk about 4 types of freedom. And I hope you can take some points from the webinar and that have motivated you really, and you can incorporate them in your daily life. So again, we will just go listen to Didi's meditation, and we'll go out in silence. Thank you, Didi. Om Shanti.
So let's sit in a comfortable position, and let's straighten our limbs, straighten our backs. Life is free. The life force of all souls is seeking its freedom. To be free, I must recognize who I am. I am the soul, living in the body. I am the being in the human form. The fundamental nature of I, the soul, is to be free. I'm immortal. I never die. I'm free from death. I'm eternal. There is no beginning or ending to me. I'm free from time. I'm imperishable. Water cannot drown me. Fire cannot burn me. The wind cannot blow me. I'm free from nature, from the environment. When I recognize that I'm a child of God, when I have my relationships with God, God frees me from the bondage of the relationships with human beings. This connection with the Supreme Being gives me the Shakti, the strength to free myself from my inner enemies. God's Shakti frees me from greed. I let go of greed and I let in generosity. I let go of anger and I let in peace. I let go of sorrow, and I let in joy. I let go of all the fears, especially the fears that cloud the truth within. The highest freedom of the soul is to release its conscience from guilt, from doubt, from falsehood, and from illusions. I, the soul, honor my freedom. A freedom that comes from my connection with God. I, the soul, I'm free. Om Shanti.